Welcome to section 2.2 of Making Sense of Mechanics. And in this section, we're really going to get stuck into force diagrams, how we understand them, and how best we can work with our students to help them as well. And in this part, we'll meet our first modelling assumption, and we'll talk about how do we discuss modelling assumptions with students. We'll do a quick recap of the list of forces, the kinds of forces we should expect to meet in mechanics problems. And then we'll get into these force diagrams, good habits of mind, how we're thinking, making sure we think clearly and almost strategically, and good habits in terms of presentation and what we expect from our students. So you may remember this little guy. He was in 1.2, this toy duck. And at the time I sort of put out this thought about, well, why is there a normal reaction up there out of his head when he's balanced on 2 or more wheels down there? Why is friction sort of hovering out of his tail, and so on? Well, this is where our first modelling assumption comes in. What we actually do is we model this duck as a particle. So that keyword there, particle, means we neglect all the physical dimensions. We forget about the physical size of this duck and shrink him down to just being a point, what mathematicians would call a point. And that removes these sort of indecision. It removes where does this force act. If the object is only a point, all those forces will be acting from a point. So let's look at that phrasing of that. What I would talk about in a classroom. I have a sort of a 3-part strategy for discussing these assumptions. First of all, what is the term that's important here? What's the key word? And right now it's that word particle. What does that word mean? So if we're modelling something as a particle, it means we're treating it as having no physical size, no physical dimensions. It's just a point. And then finally, after the meaning, well, what's the effect of that? What impact does that have on our mechanics, on our model? Well, the impact is, the main one, all the forces will act at one point. That's the most crucial part here. There is a consequence for this one. That means that the object won't be able to rotate or topple. There won't be any meaning there anymore. If you have a large object and you push at the top that way and at the bottom that way, you can cause the object to rotate or topple over. If the object is just a point, those forces will directly oppose each other. There's no meaning anymore to rotating or toppling. Is that good or bad? That depends on you, to be honest. You're the person doing the modelling, taking the mechanical situation. If rotation and toppling are important considerations, then don't model the object as a point. But if that's not an issue, even something like a Formula 1 car racing down the track, we're not interested in there if that's going to topple. Hopefully nothing like that happens. Once we've figured out the forces and appropriate values and so on, modelling it as a point probably isn't as bad as it seems. So that's our first modelling assumption. And that means we can draw a force diagram. I'm not just going to draw a point. It would just be very hard to see. So just a circle or a small box, and then we can attach force arrows to that. And I've attached the 4 forces that we talked about: weight, friction, normal reaction, tension. We discussed those last time. Okay. So the kind of forces that we can meet, we have this list. I've added some labels to it as now. So a weight force, remember, weight's the only force that exists without direct physical contact. W, if you don't know what the weight is, or more commonly mg. So remember, m will be the mass of the object when you know it, and g is this constant, which in maths we take to be 9.8. Pulls and pushes, perhaps P. Tension and thrust, remember these are pulls and pushes by proxy using a string or a rod. T works well for both of those. Normal reaction. Those of you experienced in teaching mechanics may have been surprised to see N here. I know a lot of people use R, but I use N for a few reasons. I'll come back to that in a minute. Friction, F, not the best choice. So F of any kind of force, but friction, F. Resistance, maybe R. There's some exam questions that tell you have a resistance, R. Driving force, I like to use D. Lift and buoyancy, maybe L or B. Just choose sensible labels, right? Things that don't clash, things that won't cause confusion. I'll make a comment about the reaction of friction, just a short comment now. So friction will get its own video in a couple of weeks' time. I'll do everything slowly and carefully then. What the point I want to make is friction and the normal reaction are sort of two parts, two components of this interaction between an object and a surface. It's just that one interaction, object on a surface, but it has this normal reaction component and it has the friction component. And I use the letter N for a few reasons. N for normal, to remind myself and student that it's normal in the sense of it's perpendicular to the surface of contact. I don't want to use R because sometimes that's used for resistance. It's another silly reason. But also the idea, these are both, N and F are both parts of a single overall interaction. And when I make the friction video, I'll show you an exam question that expects students to know the difference between normal reaction, straight up, and just in general terms, the reaction, which is the overall, it's the combined resultant effect of both N and F. So throughout my teaching, throughout this course, you'll see me use N for the normal reaction. Okay, let's move on. Some points for the classroom. First of all, about equipment. I would say everybody needs a 4-bic. Get the clicky pen, okay, or at least 3 or 4 different coloured pens in that pencil case. We're going to use a lot of colour in force diagrams in a very systematic way. Okay, it's not just random assignment of colours to whatever you feel like. We use it in a very careful way here. And of course a pencil and a ruler, all the usual maths equipment for neatness and clarity. And I would say here, do lead by example. You can see on this picture of my room, I have a few coloured board pens ready to use. I've also got one of those large board rulers. It's magnetic, it just clips onto the board with the magnets, so I can draw straight lines. Because I think we should hold ourselves to that standard. Every diagram we draw should be done to the standard that we expect from our own students. Okay, so use the ruler, use the same systematic colour scheme, lead by example. Later on, we'll also talk about an activity for the classroom, which I'm calling comparative judgment. Maybe I'm not using that term correctly here, but I know what I mean by it, and I'll explain that as a classroom activity, which I think will really help your students later on. So the crucial process is being able to take an exam question and to create a force diagram from it. So here is a problem, I believe this is an AQA paper from a few years back. What you may want to do, if you want the chance to read this before my explanation continues, press pause right now and have a read. Okay, so we've got this description of a box. I'm going to cross out one of these phrases straight away. That's talking about the motion of the box, and the motion doesn't really affect the force diagram in any meaningful way. So I'm going to remove that distraction, focus on the key information that we've got. And we're asked to draw a force diagram showing the forces acting on the box. And I want to emphasize that phrase right now. We should always use that phrasing, the forces on, and then specify an object. Okay, I'm sort of preempting some problems, but if a student is unable to finish that sentence and clearly, then there's probably a misconception, a misunderstanding, and their diagram will go wrong. So which object are we focusing on? The force is acting on, and here it's this box. Okay. So in terms of colour scheme, I use black on the board, and I get students to either use black or pencil for the physical objects, the physical situation. We've got a slope, we've got a box. That 40 degrees is just a bit of data, but it's an important number for the situation. So get the physical situation drawn in, as I say, black or pencil, with a ruler, keep it neat. Put the box a fair way up the slope. We don't want it colliding with the 40 degrees. We don't want information overlapping. Okay, I'm not so strict, just get a protractor out. That's almost certainly not 40 degrees that I've drawn, but there is a slope there, and that's good enough. Now we think about the forces. Classic one first. There's a weight force. We're told the mass is 3, so the weight force is 3 multiplied by g, 3g. The box is resting on a slope, so there will be a normal reaction. Normal means perpendicular to the contact, perpendicular to the slope. Then we look back at the question, and I've highlighted there that word rough. Rough slope means there is friction. A smooth slope would have no friction. So we need to draw a friction arrow. We remember that friction opposes the motion, or opposes attempted motion. And even with my crossed out sentence, I hope you can agree, this box can't just roll up the hill. That's not possible. It can't just go up. The tendency of this box will be to slide down. Okay, and the phrase that I crossed out does tell us that it slides down, which means that friction will act parallel to the slope, but upwards against the motion. And we're finished. But at this point, quite often students are a bit hesitant, like, are we finished? Are we missing a force? Is there a bit more going down? So we need to make finishing the diagram also quite an active thought process. I'm going to come back to my phrase about physical contact. Is the box in physical contact with any other object? Let's look at it. The box is in contact with the slope, or we've drawn the normal reaction and the friction. Is it in physical contact with anything else? No. Then there can't be any other force. So we know we're finished. We're certain that we finished. Okay. Always make that an active part of drawing your diagram, deciding when you've finished. Sounds silly, but it's an important thought. If you are new to mechanics and you're worried, well, isn't there something sort of down the slope making it move? No, there isn't. There can't be, because of what we just said. And in fact, it's the weight force, it's the Earth's pull down on this box that makes it move, albeit it's down at an angle. It's the Earth's pull that's getting it to move. There's no other force to draw. So now let me talk about this classroom activity, which I'm calling comparative judgment. And it works like this. I would suggest paper. Mini whiteboards are not good for this because students won't use a ruler. They can't use the different colours. Okay, red for forces, black for objects, and so on. It will just be a scruffy mess. So although mini whiteboards are great, go for paper for this. What I suggest you do is get an A4 piece of paper. Sorry, it goes a bit see-through on the camera. And get the students to fold it in half. And they'll be using one half to start. Now this is a great activity for example, the day after, the lesson after you've talked through force diagrams and these good habits. Okay, so the following lesson, it works as a bit of retrieval and a chance for improvement. So on the half piece of paper, you'll have a scenario on the board. Now I've got the same one, but a new scenario for the students, and ask them to draw a force diagram on this half of the piece of paper. Okay, first thing they do, not looking at each other, not talking to each other, draw their force diagram. And as they start to finish, go around the room, start to collect up the finished ones. I don't know how big your classes are, but collect up 5, 10 or a dozen, not too many more than that. And with blue tack or with magnets or whatever you've got, start to just lay them out across your whiteboard if you can. In the next step, you'll end up with this sort of rogues gallery, as it were, of force diagrams. Get the students to see it. They need to come closer, get them up, get them looking, but focus their attention. Tell them to look for differences. Okay, so don't just get them just look. Tell them to look for differences. What do they notice in terms of differences? And what I found works well is to come up with a sort of a two-way scale of sorting these diagrams. So with the blue tack or the magnets, they could be moved around on the board into different positions. And I suggest a scale like this. Horizontally, some kind of increasing in correctness. So that would mean they have the right number of forces in the right positions, in the right directions. That would put a diagram over this end. And going up, some sort of tidiness, neatness. Have they used the colour scheme? Black for physical objects, red for forces. Okay, have they used a ruler? And so on. So obviously, a diagram that ends up over here would be correct, but a mess. Okay, scruffy. Diagram up here would be beautiful, but sadly wrong in some respects, missing forces or some incorrect arrows. And of course up here, this sort of Goldilocks zone, the correct and carefully drawn diagram. That's where we're aiming for. If you do have any work down in this corner, it happens. Okay, those will be the students that you'll give some attention to very soon. Okay, because what I then get you to do, take these diagrams back down, make sure every student has their piece of paper again, and they can use the second half now. This is a bit like, is it called Austin's butterfly? This improvement in your drawing. And then you put a second scenario up, a new one, a variation, and ask students to draw a new improved diagram on the second half of their piece of paper. And you can keep an eye on those while students are busy. Help these students a bit, talk to them about their misunderstandings, get things cleared up, and improve in this direction first, of course. Get the mathematics correct before worrying about the perfect presentation with a ruler and the colours. So that's an activity I like to do. It works well. You must get students over to this side horizontally and try to get them high. There will be some that always resist and somehow just never quite produce work as neat as we'd hope. But neat diagrams, perhaps I should say correlate with correct mathematics happening later on. The neater the diagram, the more likely it is you'll get the rest of the solution correct. Okay, I'll talk through one. This is a longer example, as you can see. And once again, if you want the chance to read it before my explanation continues, then press pause right now. So what we have here, there's a car, there's a caravan, there's a tow bar, there's a lot of text above and below, some data, some forces, some masses, an unknown force P, with even an acceleration at the end. And even looking at this, you'll think, well, there's two objects in here. There's a car and there's a caravan. And I'd agree, but I'd go further. There's four objects here. There's a car, there's a caravan, there's a tow bar, there's the ground. So when it comes to a force diagram, remember that phrasing, we're going to draw the forces acting on. We have to make a choice now. On the car. Yes, we'll do that. A diagram showing the forces on the caravan. Yes, we'll do that. A diagram showing forces on the tow bar. We could, but we won't do that. It's not really a helpful thing to draw. Diagram showing forces acting on the ground. We could, but we never would do that, like I say. So we will draw the forces acting on the car. We will draw the forces acting on the caravan. And remember, we'll model them as particles. We're not going to draw cars on our page. And we're also going to separate them. They're very close together in this picture. Let me show you the start of my force diagram. Move them apart. Okay, it's important to make space between them because these are going to be separate diagrams. Conceptually, they're separate, and we don't want any risk of overlap or interference between them. Okay, we'll start with the car just here. It has a weight force, mass times g. There'll be a normal reaction because it's resting on the road, vertically upwards. We're told in the text that there's a resistance force. So resistance here is like an umbrella term for friction, air resistance, anything that's hindering the motion of the car. It's been lumped together into one value, 200. We're told that this car has an engine exerting a driving force. So in the direction of motion, we've got that force labelled P. P is given to us as the label in the question. After drawing a few forces, you get close to the point of thinking, have I done? Have I drawn them all? That active process, have we finished? Is the car in physical contact with any other object? Yes, the tow bar. And if students aren't sure what to draw here, it's almost like role play you can do with them. Get them to imagine you are the car, you're driving, you're moving forwards. You've got this tow bar behind you. What do you feel because of that tow bar? Get them to imagine it. They're driving forwards, the tow bar. Hopefully they'll get that idea that it's sort of holding them back, it's pulling them back. And that shows us that, yeah, we're drawing a tension force now, that pull by proxy, the tow bar pulling on the back of the car. The car's not in physical contact with anything else, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 forces, we're finished. That is a complete diagram showing the forces acting on the car. Now, the caravan, do it a bit quicker, but it's got a weight, normal reaction, it's also got a resistance, and it will feel like it's being pulled forwards because of the car in front of it. It will feel the tension pulling it in the forwards direction. The caravan doesn't have an engine. There's no driving force inside the caravan. Okay. Now, there is a modelling assumption we'll come to later, which actually tells us that these tension forces are the same size. We can label them both as T, T. They'll be equal and opposite forces, T for both of them. But the normal reactions will be different. So N1, N2, NA, NB, NM. Choose whichever pair of labels you're comfortable with, just making sure that they are distinct. Final sentence of this question mentions this acceleration down here. If you want to show that on your diagram, obviously that's about the motion. We'll study that in our next part actually. But my habits here are to change colour again. Okay, I go for green. I draw it as a double arrowhead. I think a lot of people do that to make it look very different from a force arrow. It's not a force. It's definitely not attached to the car. It's just some data that we need near the diagram. Okay, so I've got a green double arrow, A equals 0.8. And each force diagram should get that, in my opinion. So the car has been labelled with its acceleration. The caravan, with its force diagram, has also been labelled with an acceleration arrow. One for each force diagram. So quite a lot of careful thoughts in there. And I would really recommend, if you're new to this and you want to practice it, look through textbooks, look through exam papers, find any story, any scenario, and have a go at getting that force diagram drawn. Black for physical objects, red for forces, green for an acceleration. Okay, that's the system that I always use. And when we get to the next part in this series, I'll start to talk about the motion that these forces cause. That's what's coming up in sort of the third instalment soon. Just before we finish today though, there's one bad habit that students can have or can get, and I want to sort of help you correct that straight away. This phrase should help. Every force should be drawn as an arrow attached to the object it is acting on. And I want to show you the classical example of where this doesn't happen with students. So imagine you've got this piece of string and a box hanging at the end of it. Students will quite often just sort of draw an arrowhead halfway up the string representing tension. And in fact, quite a lot of students will also put another one somewhere near the top of the string pointing the other direction because they feel tension is always happening at both ends. Now, let's make this much better. If we're drawing the forces acting on the box, okay, let's use our four-part phrase. There is a tension force acting on the box vertically upwards because of the string. So that means we draw a careful arrow on this box vertically upwards, attached to the box. Draw an actual arrow, not just the little head halfway up the string. Okay, T for tension. We don't draw this other force up here. There would be a force up there, but that would be acting on the ceiling or whatever's holding the string. Remember, we just draw the forces acting on one object, acting on the box. Obviously, this box would also have a weight arrow, but I'm just focusing on that tension issue. Sometimes students get lazy, and I know it will cause problems further down the line if we're not strict on these habits from the beginning. So there we go. That's the end of this section. And as promised, next week, in the next part, we'll be looking at the motion that these forces cause. See you then.